Every story knows its teller. Every story has its time. Every story knows its teller. Yours and mine has its place and time. Every story knows its teller. Every story has its time. Every story knows its teller. Yours and mine has its place and time. It's time. It's time.
Hi. We are delighted to have Philippa Namatebi Kabali-Kagwa here, and she is going to talk to us about her memoir, Flame and Song. Philippa is a storyteller, leadership coach, facilitator, and of course, a writer. Her memoir of life and family in Uganda, and also it's about the transition and moving, and ultimately about what it means to be home, and what the concept of home means. It's beautiful, intimate, and important. I'm delighted to have Philippa here tonight to share her story with us. And with Philippa, we have Diana Mutoni and Sandrine Mpazayapo. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for that. We just want to welcome you here in this space of talking and sharing. As close as we are, may we just enjoy this time and just hear Philippa as she talks us through her book. But otherwise, it's a time of sharing. It's sensitive, it has memories as she'll be sharing with us. And I just want to welcome everyone, also welcoming all our East African people.
Yes.
Hello, hello, hello. Habari Kenya, habari Tanzania. I didn't hear you. Habari Kenya, habari Tanzania. Thank you. Uganda.
Yes.
Sanyisenyo balawa basewo ne banyabo. Thank you. Auntie Suli de Kalulu. Neanza. Rwanda, anybody?
Yes.
Amakuru yawe? Thank you very much. And South Africa, we love you. We are happy to be here. If I speak all the 11 official languages, we might have a sleepover. Thank you very much, and thank you, Philippa, for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for being here today, Philippa, and thank you for everyone who is here. So, after reading the book, the first thing that came to me was the realization that you sat down and you thought, I want to write about my life. I want to share my story. And I wanted to know what inspired that decision to write a memoir, especially as opposed to a novel or an anthology. What made you decide to write about your life?
So, good evening, everybody. It started out actually as a grieving process. Having lived away from home for a long time, writing has been for me the place I go to make sense of stuff, to process my life. And so after both my parents died, I had been writing, and I was sitting here thinking, I have spent most of my life in Cape Town. It's now that time, and why is that? And what am I doing here? And who am I? And I started by just writing a reflection, and some of it came in poetry, some of it came in prose. And somewhere through that writing, a friend of mine, Gertrude Mache, was encouraging people to write, and she said, Philippa, write it. And I thought, but who'd be interested? So I read a little bit here to someone and a little bit there to somebody. And then it was also the time when Uganda, a lot of African countries were turning 50. And I thought, what have we achieved in these 50 years? And most people talk about Uganda, it's about Idi Amin, right? HIV and AIDS, right? Some of you might know Museveni. But in all of those things, normal, everyday, ordinary people like me lived our lives. I am of a generation where many of us are across the diaspora because of that particular moment in time. And I thought we need to tell our stories. if we don't, then who? And so that's how I started, and that became a book.
And I think for most of us, the process of opening up is a fairly difficult one. It's difficult to share so much of yourself in such great detail. And I wanted to know, how difficult was it for you, and how did you get to the point where you could open up in such great detail about your life?
I don't know. I think because of the work I do, I'm a coach. I take organizations also through change processes. My life work is about getting other people to open up, to bear themselves, to share their lives, to explore their lives. And so for me, in order to do that, I've had to also find ways to do that. So it wasn't so hard. I also find that I am probably at my most creative when I'm at my most vulnerable. And when I try and shut down a part of me, everything else shuts down. So for me to tap into my creativity, I do have to tap into that. It's the way it is.
Was it a conscious decision for you to decide which bits of information you wanted to share and which bits you wanted to keep sacred? Or, because I noticed, I was reading the book, and then one minute you were in high school, the next moment you were married. And I was just like, what did I miss? Did I miss anything? So I wanted to know whether that was, did you consciously decide, I'm going to keep that to myself? Or was that just kind of the flow of the book as you had imagined it?
Okay, so there are certain things and certain stories and certain incidents that I went through, that I wrote, that I processed, that I felt I cannot put in the book because it's not my story to tell, or because I haven't processed it with the people who are part of that story, and therefore I have to hold it sacred. The getting from like high school, university into marriage, the book was not supposed to be about Cape Town, but I was writing it from Cape Town, and so in the editorial process there's a question of, you are in Cape Town, the reader's going to wonder, how come you're in Cape Town, how did you get to Cape Town? And so it was important for the reader to kind of put in bits about Cape Town. The other story, wait for the next book. Or not.
One thing that I really enjoyed about the book was that it's not simply prose. There's poetry as well, and the poetry is so colorful, and it's blended so well, it's so fluid. It flows from a poem to a prose in such a manner that one doesn't even see the difference, in a sense. So one poem that for me was especially resonant was Extravaganza. When you were younger and you were dancing with your brothers and sisters. And I wanted to know whether you could share that with us, because that was especially resonant, I think.
Right. So I grew up in a family of 5. I'm the youngest of 5. I had 2 brother and sister who came before me who had cerebral palsy, and then 2 older sisters. And like most Africans, there was always many people in the house. And when my cousins came over, we'd have concerts and then pass the tin around so that we could get some money so we could buy sweets. So this is about that. The adults sit upright on dining room chairs in the sitting room turned concert hall. The staircase, a dark wooden backdrop to the stage. Someone welcomes them. Item number 1. All the children singing and dancing Nora's Indian song. Mwogo wali mali mali, mwogo wali mali, eva pali, chakara chakara, shugary shari. Foreign words that are probably incorrect. Hand and leg movements imperfect. Faces beaming. Next, Joyce's song. Choir in place, hands together, and Sikwendera, sikwendera, sipiriti, sipiriti, sikwendera, sikwendera, oh sipiriti, oh, oh, oh sipiriti, oh, The parents clap, the performers move on with glee to the finale, the Bakisimba dance. White enamel basin, now a throbbing drum. Olunkutiza, 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 olukutwala Bakisimba, buktubu, buktubu. Dancers in line, sweaters on hips. The singers start. Tweyanze, tweyanze, walalala kawete memwongere chupa. Nabulagala tweyanze, tweyanze, walalala kawete memwongere chupa. Nabulagala. The dancers march in, kneel down. Clasped hands move left, clasped hands move right, and then they stand. Hips swivel this way and that, feet stepping steady to the beat, singing, clapping, and ululating. The audience joins in. The basin drum climaxes. Toot-toot-toot, 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 toot-toot-toot-toot-toot-toot. Bah! The concert ends. Eyes shining, the hat is passed around. The sweet promise of tomorrow.
Thank you very much for that. I can't help myself. I feel like dancing. You can hear the beat, literally. So, Philippa, I'm about to ask you about Faye and Chris. In the book, you really describe this relationship as a very sensitive one. And just to touch on it, if you could just please read to us page 31 in the book.
Family and friends who were often in our home learned quickly that Faye and Chris were at the heart of our household. We ate with them, I bathed with them, and I shared all my early birthday parties with them too. I realize now that although Daddy bought Mama the Kenwood chef as a birthday present, it was also necessary to liquidize food for Faye and Chris and to mince their meat. As soon as she unpacked it, she made something for all of us to share, so it became ours. It took me a long time to find the words to explain what I intuitively understood, probably around the age 5, that they were different from most people, and we loved them as much, or more. They were like our unconventional Christmas trees. Not firs like everyone else's, but beautiful all the same.
So, Philippa, what was your relationship like with Faye and Chris?
So, Faye and Chris were my sister and brother who came before me. They both had cerebral palsy. And I don't know, I was like a caregiver. I was like a caregiver. I spent a lot of time with Faye and Chris. I learned to read them because they couldn't speak, but they understood. I knew they understood because they'd laugh at jokes. And Faye had the most expressive fingers. If she thought you were stupid, she'd do this and her fingers would bend backwards and you'd feel really idiotic. So I spent a lot of time reading their bodies, listening to them, reading their eyes, trying to make sense of what was going on in their life. And I was a great protector of them because people would sometimes talk about them as if they weren't there or talk about them as if they were stupid. And then it didn't matter how old you were, I would give you an earful of exactly what I thought and why I thought you were wrong and why I was their defender, their playmate, their sister, their reader.
So I don't know if people would agree with me on this, but in the African culture, there's almost this differentiation that takes place, whereby having such an illness is taken as a taboo, or you've been bewitched. They do not understand that something could be maybe a brain tumor or a sickness like that. And then you get another culture which takes it as a scientific illness. It's taken as this happened, so this happened. therefore the person is walking like this. What is it about your family that decided to take Faye and Chris as normal children, which they were normal, and dress them up on Sunday, take them to church, yet other Ugandans left their children at home, hiding them away as if it was dirty closet, but you decided to take them out, walk with them. Christmas, they were out, talking with others.
Okay, we're having mic issues. I don't know. I think it was my parents. They were courageous. My mother was a small woman. Eh? She always told us my waist was 22 inches when I got married. And she was short, but she was fierce and deeply intelligent, and these were her children, and God had given them to her, so she was going to make it work. And I only know in 2000, when my dad was really sick, I was looking after him in hospital once, and he said, "Philippa, nobody knows the tears your mother and I cried alone at night in our bedroom when nobody was there. But this was our life when we had the courage." And through what they did, I think they made it okay for other people to bring their children out. They started a school for the physically handicapped, which is still there. And yeah, I don't know. I think they had deep faith. I think they had deep love for each other. And they were the kind of people who, if this is what God has given you, then well, that's it. Let's move on. Let's live with it. Let's make it work.
And also, I notice your children take on some of the names, which is Faye and Chris. Who came up with this, and what is there an idea behind it?
So before we got married, my sister Faye was in preschool at some point, and she was actually in preschool with my husband. So I always tease him that he was probably in love with my sister when they were kids, and he would have married her, but he got me. So we were dating, and we were sitting one day on the stairs, and he said to me, "What will we call our first child?" And I was like, "First child," because I wasn't in that space yet. I was like, "This is my boyfriend, first child?" You know? And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "What will we call our first child?" And he said, "Faye." And I said, "Okay," and laughed. Because for me it wasn't a serious thing, but that was it. And there she is. There she is in the pink. And then with Saint-Ezar, well, I might as well tell Saint-Ezar, there he is. Hi, come, you said I didn't introduce you. Stand up. Be introduced. That's my second born. And when he came along, we had been living in South Africa for 2 years. We were really tired of these South Africans. We lived in Tygerberg in the doctor's quarters. It was 1995. We'd been here since 1993. Our child was not going to have any name except an African name, and he was going to be called Saint-Ezar, and that was it. And then my father-in-law called him Moses, so he got one anyway. And then with Chris, I was pregnant with him, and he's a Latlamaki. I was 44 plus. I was feeling quite depressed. I had a letter from the doctor I had to go for that scan, you know, where they make sure that everything is in the right place and the child is fine. And I really felt like crying, and I sat in my study and I opened this letter and I saw XY, and I knew it was a boy. I never knew the genders of my other children. But in that moment, I felt as if my father was standing behind me, and my brother Chris was on my right side, and he was laughing. And I felt my grandfathers and my uncles, all the men in the family who had passed, I just felt them behind me, and I felt my father saying, "It's okay. Take this child, you'll be fine." So he was Christopher and a lot of other names which I won't go into. And then that's how it came about. So
I could relate to a lot of the parts of the book, especially the ones where you were in Tygerberg Hospital and you were staying in the doctor's quarters with your husband. I was born in Tygerberg Hospital and I've always stayed quite close. So it was beautiful to see how your experience there kind of is parallel to how my parents experienced that area at that time. And I think another important part of the book is when your sister Faye passes away. I wanted to know how it was for you mourning for her in a foreign country. Yes, and I think it would be wonderful for you to read the extract of you hearing about your sister's death and your immediate sort of reaction to that.
So I was married then, and we returned to Oshakati. We were in Oshakati, Namibia at that time, and we just come back from our wedding, and I didn't have my work permit, which they should have processed in December when we were busy getting married, had not been processed because some papers hadn't been sent through. So I had to go from Oshakati to Windhoek, which is 800 kilometers away. Early in the morning on the 7th of February, as I prepared to go to Home Affairs, Yuha's wife knocked on the door of my room. I had a phone call from Victor, that's my husband. He told me that my sister Faye had passed away that morning from complications with pneumonia. She was 30 years old. I hung up. I felt as if the world had stopped. Later I phoned Victor back to confirm what he had told me. And I phoned home too to speak to my parents. I did not know what to do. I couldn't go home for the funeral. It was too soon after the wedding and money was tight. To make matters worse, my work permit had not been issued because the office at Oshakati did not send in the final paperwork to Windhoek in December as they had promised. My December and January salaries had not been processed because of the work permit. And I had gone to Windhoek to sort it out. And now this. I put my grief aside and went to the Home Affairs office to sort out my problem. Around noon, after standing in many lines and walking between Home Affairs and Department of Education, I was told that my application was late and there was nothing they could do. The guidelines for employing foreigners had changed in January, and I would have to reapply for my job. I felt as if my world was crashing in on me. I asked to see a manager, and he said that only the permanent secretary could assist me. That is, if I could get an appointment with him. So I went to his office and I asked to see him. I knew that I would not be able to make my sister's funeral, but I was going to make sure that this would not be a problem again if anything else happened. I explained to his assistant that my application had actually been made the previous year before the new laws, and that there was outstanding document from Oshakati. I believed that the new guidelines did not apply to me, and the assistant said that the permanent secretary was going to a meeting and would not be able to see me until next week. I said I would wait for him to return, and I would not leave until I had seen him. Oshakati was too far away. I sat and I waited. At 4 p.m. he got back and she told him that I had refused to leave. We spoke and he said I was right. And then he signed my papers and he picked up the phone and told someone to process my document. And the next morning, before we drove back to Oshakati, I got my work permit. 10 hours later, in my house in Oshakati, I broke down and wept for the sister I had lost.
Thank you for that. So you were in South Africa, Cape Town, a working mother, and you were in Namibia at the time, and your sister was in Uganda and had passed away. I remember you writing that there wasn't much time to grieve. What exactly did you mean by that, especially in concerning both the amount of time and also just the stage that you were in your life?
I've learned over the years that grief isn't something that you can program or process. It's visceral, it has its own life, and with both the passing of my sister Faye and my brother Chris, I didn't have time to grieve. With Faye, I had to kind of get my work permit. You know, life has to move on. I need to make sure I'm not kicked out of this country. And sometimes that's what happens. You have to put aside the grieving process. It will come back. Believe you me, you will one day find yourself crying and you won't know why. Grief will happen. It's like water. It seeps through you when it needs to. But you can't program it. You just have to let it be what it is. Yeah, that's what I meant. And so sometimes I grieved well for my mother. But that's partly because I went home a number of times. When I was writing, I realized that I'm not sure whether I really did grieve for Faye and Chris, but in the writing of the book, and that's why April was a crazy month and my editor was a bit frustrated with me because I was writing about that part and I needed to let go and be in my process and then get back into the writing. So yeah, that's what I meant.
Thank you. I also wanted to know, how exactly does one go about mourning the loss of a loved one when one isn't close to them, distance-wise, in a foreign country?
For me, because I think everybody's process is different, I write, I sing, I cry. You have to get on with living as well, because that's part of grieving, that your life has to continue. For my parents, the writing of the book has been part of that process of just retelling the story, of going back into it. And sometimes it's helping other people grieve. You know, my friend Charlene is here. When her dad died, her sister Birgit is my sister from Cape Town, from another mother and father. But when their dad died, the only way, he died exactly a year after my father died, and the only way I could grieve with them, but I think it was part of my grieving my father, was to go to their house, to sleep over the night before, because that's what I would have done in Uganda, to wake them up in the morning and tell each one of them, eat breakfast. You're not leaving this house and going to the funeral without eating breakfast, because that's what people did for me when so it's kind of doing to others what is done for me, which helps me feel like I'm doing my own grieving stuff. Yeah.
Namtevi, there's a part in the book where you describe Namtevi, no, you're Namtevi, yes. There's a part where you describe your mother's passing, and they're just driving past. Someone is driving the car with her body in the car, but there's something very symbolic about it. If you could just please read this part to me, it's page 158.
We drove Mama past the Kampala School for the Physically Handicapped, which she and my father had founded. We passed the palace of the Kabaka, Isawaya Queen, through Zambia to Kabali-Kagwa, past the market and John Rich supermarket where she had shopped, and past the Italian shop, and finally we were home.
So to those who have just heard this part, there's something about how the body is just traveling through Uganda, driving past memories where your mother had been very intimate with, in the shops where she would buy vegetables and, bargain for veggies. And then there's the School of the Handicapped, and it's still living. It's almost as though she has lost breath. But there's breath in where the car is driving past. So if you could just talk me through the legacy that she, in other words, left. As much as you took the body to the home where she loved you all, there's a part of her almost that is alive.
I don't even know. It's my mother. Oh, my mother. She was a small, tough woman. She was one of the first women in Uganda to go to university. And she was the first, I think she was the first African woman, maybe the first African headmistress of Nabumali High School, which is the high school that she went to. Her legacy lives in the Kampala School for the Physically Handicapped, for example. I remember when my father died, the Old Boys and Old Girls organization were the first people to put an obituary in the newspaper before us. Before we as a family put it in, it was there. But the school, during Idi Amin, a lot of the physiotherapists and the people who could help Faye and Chris left the country. So it got to a point where my brother and sister and children who were mentally disabled could not really be supported in the school. So Faye and Chris stopped going to school, but my parents stayed connected with that school all their lives. They were always part of that school, so there's a big legacy there. And like all African families, you know, we had cousins, we had aunties and uncles who lived in the house. There are so many people that her life touched. This book is because of her. She taught me how to read. She, at 11, looked at my composition and said, no, your teacher's not doing a good job. Come, let me teach you how to do it. and she helped me, you know. So I think her legacy lives in so many different ways. Yeah, she's a hard act to follow. I don't think we could follow her. We could do little bits of the things that she did, but...
How is the school today?
The school is still there. I haven't been there for a very long time, but the school must be turning 50 this year. And it's still there. And the headmistress was in high school with my sisters. Vicky, you know her, I forget her name. She had a very long neck. She was in Gayaza. Very tall, yes. Her name has escaped me, but it is still there.
I think that would be the epitome of a legacy that really lives. And now that you have children, Maleza, Estella, not your children, but now that your siblings have family of their own, and in contrast with how your parents raised you, with them having that closeness, for example, the extravaganza you've read to us, the community always being together. How about now when your children are in different lands? Is that togetherness still there? Do the children know their roots?
They're here, I'll ask them. One of the things we tried to do with Victor was, living here, we tried very hard to take our children home every 2 years. So they know where they come from. They know their grandparents on my husband's side, they know their grandparents on my side, they know their cousins. My sister-in-law Vicky is here, and they lived in East London, and we often, if we weren't in Uganda for Christmas, then we were with them for Christmas. So we've tried very, very hard to keep a family, a sense of family. And then we've grown family. There are people sitting in here who are my South African sisters, who my children know these are aunties and uncles that I can go to if I have a problem. So we've really, really done that. And the thing that also happened was after my father died, I talk in the book about the fourth generation. The young people of my children's generation saw that our generation knew each other. We knew our cousins from my mom's side and cousins from my dad's side, and they kind of all knew who was who and where they fit. And they decided they were going to start the fourth generation, and they started meeting every term, at least once, and cook together and get to know each other. It didn't last forever, but I think for a couple of years, it went on, and I think that legacy of those connections still remains today.
And then there's a part I want to talk about that really not really touched me, but something I always think about. I had an East African tour just last year, whereby I just wanted to see Africa and what's happening. But in every country I reached in East Africa, they gave me a tribe. So they allocate you. So I'm in Uganda, I hear someone whispering behind me, Abombamanyi, you know those ones who have some Indian blood, that's why she's light. So that's the explanation. I can hear them, they're speaking Luganda, I can hear them. Then I go to Kenya, for example. Kenyans, they didn't say much, the men just wanted to get married. Then came Rwanda, I'm either Tutsi or I'm Hutu. Then I come to South Africa, they're like, okay, so are you Zulu, are you Ndebele, are you this and that? So this idea of being given a tribe or a race wherever you go, you've dealt with it in your traveling, and we hear how when you were, I believe in Kenya, when a girl asks you, so what tribe are you? And I can only imagine that girl's attitude in that moment. What would you say, and how did you actually belong when you reached a country?
These days I say I'm a daughter of Africa, because here they ask me, I say, andithethe isiXhosa, they say, uyabua, ukhuluma, Shangan, Afrikaans, wherever I am, I think I have features that can fit. And so it's a good thing because you can blend in. It's not a good thing because sometimes people think you're too proud to speak their language. And so what I learned from my mother was, when you meet people, at least learn a little bit of their language. I mean, I'd look at my mother in the market and she'd greet everybody in their language. And so what I try and do is I learn a little bit of the language. And sometimes I like the fact that I blend in and nobody knows where I come from. And sometimes it irritates me and I throw my toys out. Yeah.
I think another important part of the book was you speaking about your grandparents and how important they were to you, and you described them in such rich detail that I felt like they were my grandparents. Like I felt fulfilled in reading that. I don't know much about my grandparents, but I really enjoyed the way you spoke about their education and their influence on you, and how kind of the closeness you had with all of them. I just wanted you to elaborate on that and how you feel they have influenced you.
So, yeah, my parents had university education. My grandmother, I didn't know, went to school. We always thought she didn't, but she did she had 3 years of schooling and then became a teacher of literacy. And she wrote me a letter. And I think I'm the only grandchild. I think that's my claim to fame. I'm the only grandchild who ever had Jaja write me a letter. It was short, and it starts Muzukuru Wange Philippa. That's how she spelled my name. But I think one of the things that was really important was education. My father's father was left cows so that he would have a dowry when his father died. And he sold his dowry so that he could go to school. And he went through education, and then he wanted to become a priest, and he started studying to become a priest. And he left it because he had to travel from Mbali to Mukono, which was a few hundred kilometers, and he could only take some of his children. And so he left the older ones behind, and they were mistreated. And then he said, look, I will not sacrifice my children for my education. And I think that's one of the things that I learned from both sides of the family, that education is important, but family is really, really important, and caring for family. And those are the two things that have always been a thread in both sides of my parents' family.
No, we'll keep that. There's something Philippa does in the book whereby she describes things very vividly, and you will see this if you get this book, whereby it makes you almost remember your own childhood. I call this one of the most affordable return tickets to Uganda. It's every little detail that you would think of in Uganda. The people selling mangoes on the street, the people in the church, the people, she does this so amazingly. And there's something that you almost reminded me of my own childhood that I just put a past, was when I first arrived in South Africa. It was my first time to see a bathtub. I'm 12 years old right now, at that time. I arrive and I see a bathtub. And I'd only seen it in the movies, but I'd only seen it with the bubbles inside. So I thought something is wrong with this one. So my dad just looks at me and says, Diana, do you want to use this or should I bring you a bucket? I said, you've read my mind, just give me the bucket. And I used the bucket. So you reminded me of those little details that you would look past, or you think maybe your childhood was not fun, therefore it's not as important as someone else's. But it's those little details that really stick with people. So I want to ask, how did you manage to portray this childhood, but also make it in a creative way to speak with people?
I just have a vivid memory, and there are certain fragments that just seem to stick in my mind, and I worked from those. But I've also learned that as a storyteller, your job is to tell people pictures. And because the oral storytelling tradition is really my first tradition, I am first an oral storyteller. I speak. And so when I write, I try very hard to speak it, and I sometimes, after I've written it, if it's not working, I read it out loud to myself and say, is it saying what I want it to say? Can they smell the mangoes? Can they smell the cows in my grandfather's yard? Can they hear the mulalo singing to the cows and calling them? Can they feel the breeze from Lake Victoria, Lake Nalubale, coming through and tickling your skin? Because that's my job as a storyteller, to take you to those places for that moment. And the books and the movies and the things that stir me the most are the ones that have done that. So I try very hard to do that.
One of the ways that you did this very well was with the Mulago 1 and 2. If you could just read that to us, whereby you've shown perspectives from two different people.
1 and 2.
Yes, 1 and 2, please.
Can I just give you background to this? I had a fragment of a memory. Okay. I had a fragment of a memory being in a Land Rover, and I didn't know what it was like, what it was about. And after my mother died, I found she had written a story about that incident. So it wasn't a figment of my imagination. So I wrote 3 poems, and I'll read 2. Faye, can I read 2? Luan, can I read 2? Thank you. At the gates of Mulago. December 1969. There was nothing extraordinary about that night when my husband and I went to bed in our suburban house on Chitante Road. Nothing until at 1 a.m. the staccato of gunfire ruptured the night skies, waking us. We did not sleep again. Morning came, grey and wet and strangely silent, a feeble sun straining through the clouds. The news filtered through. On the radio, the president had been shot in the jaw. He lay in Mulago Hospital, stable. As I contemplated the day, Lightning streaked the sky. The rumbling in my tummy echoed the rumbling of the distant thunder. This was the morning I had to take our little one to Mulago Hospital for another measles shot. My husband held me close. I'll send the driver to take you. I sat next to my child in the front cab of the Land Rover, the roar of the engines louder with each gear change, diesel fumes filling the cab. And outside, people walked, bodies strangely taut, eyes darting from side to side, as if expecting another shower of gunfire. We stopped at the entrance. One of the gates ripped off its hinges. On the ground, 2 men lay, bodies twisted grotesquely. "They are dead," said the driver. My little one stood up, looked at the bodies silently. I gently turned her head away and held her close. As we drove in through the hospital gates, a Black Maria police van arrived to take the bodies away. At the gates of Mulago too, December 1969. 5 years old, sitting next to Mama in the front of the Land Rover, going for a shot. I must be brave. The ride is big, noisy, bumpy, smelly, not like Mama's car. We stop at the hospital gates. My heart beats faster. Outside, the big people talk in loud, short bursts. I hear no smiles, no greetings. My heart wants to run away. I stand up and look out. Policemen with guns, no smiles on their faces. A man twisted on the ground, another not so far away. "They're dead," says the driver to Mama. A coldness in my tummy. I look at the big people. Their hearts are beating faster too, I think. Mama pulls me back into my seat closer to her as we drive in through the gates.
I think that was wonderful. Thank you for that. I noticed while reading the book there was a recurrent theme revolving around fire, and also the joyous and sometimes mournful importance of song. And with that, I wanted to know what inspired you to title the book Flame and Song?
So the song was actually first called She of the Ashes and Flames. And I wanted to use the theme of fire, that sometimes we burn with fire, we burn with passion, we burn with anger, we burn with fear, you know, and stupidity also. and sometimes it feels as if the fire is burning low, and sometimes there's even ashes. And when you feel through the ashes, you find embers, and if you blow on them, the fire relights again. And life is like that, you know. When you've lived as long as some of us, you realize it goes up and down and up and down. And if it's down, you know, it will go up again. And so I wanted to use that. And then we called it From the Ashes and Flames or something. But then there's a book about 1976 that was called Year of Ashes, Year of Flames or something like that. And I was very upset about that when Colleen sent me the email because I had to change the title. And she asked what I thought, and I just shut up. Because I've had this title for 3 years, why must I change it now? And then, was it Lauren? I think Lauren, somebody suggested Flame and Song. And it slowly grew on me. Yeah, and now I like it actually.
Thank you again for your time. I think this book is very, very important, and it's extraordinary. There were parts of the book that I could relate to, coming to Cape Town, feeling like you don't belong, and then finally finding yourself in that. there were parts of the book that my parents could relate to. They were also taught gymnastics by Korean instructors when they were young. So there were lots of the books that I saw myself, I saw my parents, I even saw my peers. The book's also quite educational. I closed the book and I knew so much about Uganda that I'd never known. So I want to say thank you for your contribution. So we're now going to open to the floor and any questions directed to Auntie Philippa.
Anybody? Everybody shy tonight?
Philippa, I haven't read the book yet, but just paging through it, it appears to be an unusual form in that it is a combination of poetry and prose, and of course in a memoir. Did you find when you decided that you wanted to publish, I'm asking this now as a writer, that it was received with caution because of that form? Because I'm finding exactly that right now.
No, actually, I sat with it for a very long time. I was going to self-publish. When I finally got the courage to send it, I sent it through to Mujaji, to Colleen, and they were silent for like 6 or 7 months, and then I got the email. I think so. It felt like that. it might have been 3. You know. I tell you, when I'm waiting for something, I have no sense of time. Time is very elastic. But it was, the form was never a question. It was never a question, and for me, it was also not a planned form. That's how the story came out, and I was very pleased that my editor and that Colleen never. It was okay.
I asked because I've been told you should publish an anthology of poetry and you should publish the story separately.
Go to Colleen. Go to Majaji.
And Philippa, thank you very much. This is not a question, it's an appreciation. I read the book. When I told my sister this morning that I read the book, she was actually surprised. And growing up, being born in Uganda, you read, you only study the history. You like, when you're doing history, you learn about your own country, through history books. And when I read your book, and knowing you and telling the story, I really appreciated that I'm reading a book being written by someone telling the same history that I learned in the history books. And it really, it affirmed everything that we've learned. When you learn something in the history, I don't know, you think it's fiction. But when it's written by someone that you know, it confirms everything. And I really want to thank you for that book, for the life you've told in that book. It's amazing, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Manuel.
Auntie Philippa. Well, obviously Faye and I are really good friends, so it's lovely to know where she comes from and to hear her story through you, which is important. My question to you is, how did you speak to your other siblings about how you portrayed Faye and Chris, and how did they take that? I'm assuming your experiences were different. Was that well received by them? Were there moments of hesitation? And I know you did keep some stories to yourselves because you thought they were sacred, but those that you shared, how did your other siblings take that and those memories?
So First of all, I didn't tell them what I was putting into the book. It was my book. It's my story. I own it. If you don't like it, but but I've had very good feedback. I've spoken to one of my sisters. I need to speak to the other one because she got the book a bit later. And no one's really questioned anything. Yesterday I got a voice note from my father's sister in Florida. She's 80-something, and part of it was my cousin telling her, "Mommy, press this and talk like this." And she said, "Philippa, I want to tell you about this bit," and she says, "We need to get together." So I'm hoping that I can have a pajama party with my auntie either in Florida or in Uganda, so she can fill in the bits that I wasn't ever able to ask my parents. But I think what it's done, and what I wanted my book to do, I wanted my book to be an invitation for people to share their stories, because if we don't tell our stories, then who will? You know, and ordinary people live extraordinary lives, and everybody has a story, and that was my motivation. And I wanted my children to know the things I hadn't asked my mom and I hadn't asked my dad. And so it's a very long answer, but it's like, yeah, it's triggered conversations more than anything else, and that's what I wanted. And no one's fighting with me yet. Yes.
Hello, I'm Philippa. I admire very much. Your daughter knows this. And my question is quite simple. I just want to know, how was it for you when you had the hard copy, comparing it to the one that you either wrote or the one that you typed out? Can you describe that moment?
Wow. It was in Artscape at Women's Zone on the 5th of August. And this book, the one I have doesn't have the full shouts. I tell people it was a premature baby. It came out a bit early, and then I had the full run. The one there's the full copy. But it was, it looks different, right? Even reading it, I couldn't find anything in the book anymore because it sits differently. And it felt good. And I think my sense of pride and joy has grown slowly. You know, it's kind of like watching this premature baby, and now we're out of the incubator, and now I can breathe, and now, yes, I actually wrote this. It feels really good.
Hello, Aunt Philippa. That's your name now. I haven't read your book, I'll admit, but I will. It's happening. But I wanted to ask you on something that you said. I know you said you grieved well for your parents. In one of your answers, that's what you said. What I want to know from that statement is, firstly, what does that mean? Do you look in retrospect and say that was a good grieving process, or like how do you know? Because you're saying for your siblings, given the circumstances, you weren't able to, but for your parents, you grieved well. So what does grieving well look like for you?
Grieving well. It means you face the grief, and I think my children, I don't know, but I think in the last 7 years I probably fell apart a little bit and then put myself back together again, and I didn't do certain things very well and I did other things very well, and I paid attention to some things I needed to. I don't know. I think you just know inside you that you've cried, and I don't think you ever stop grieving, but it's a different thing when you haven't grieved, because it trips you up. You'll find yourself falling apart in the wrong places, or shouting at people, or fighting with people you're not really supposed to. You're not fighting with them, but they're in front of you and they're the only people you can fight with, so you'll fight with them. And when you've grieved well, you've had time to talk about the people. For my mother, let me say, I went back to Uganda 3 times because I had to help sort out her estate. And In Cape Town, no, very few people knew my mother. Every time I went to Kampala, there'd be a funeral, or I'd go to church and someone said, "Hey, mwala wa faisi olio tiango labie." And you'd go to the market and someone would say, "Hey, Bambi, Jaja yagulanga wale nyanya." You know, Jaja used to buy tomatoes from me. Here, take a few extra, because, you know, you go to pay the electricity bill and someone says, "Are you Mrs. Barlow's children?" And then she calls everybody, come, here's Mrs. Barlow's children. And they all come and they say, "I'm really sorry about your mother." Or people come and tell you stories about your mother that you didn't know. That's grieving well. And that's what's so hard about grieving far away, because it's dislocated, nobody knows. So the temptation is to just tie your belt tighter and just move through the grief as if it's not there. But you have to allow the grief to be there in order to move on with life.
We've reached the end. First of all, thanks to Philippa for sharing her story with us tonight. Thanks for Diana and Sandrine coming out and chatting to us. And thanks to Majaji Books and Colleen and her team for always bringing out fantastic stories. And thanks to Leopard's Leap for the free wine. And just to let you know what's coming up at the book launch for the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have Richard Calland here, and he's launching his latest Make or Break. And Richard will be in conversation with Marianne Tam, and that launch is 6 for 6:30. And then on Thursday we have Leon de Kock here, and he'll be in conversation with Wamui Mbao, and he'll be talking about his book, Losing the Plot, Crime, Reality and Fiction in Post-Apartheid Writing. Thanks for coming out.